Hi, thank you so much, Professor Chris Berry, for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Over the past several years, you've conducted some important, highly regarded research looking at property taxes and how they're levied. Why are property taxes such an important issue, and what got you so interested in the topic?
Well, I got interested in it, I think, the same way so many people do and so many of our students do, which is that, I came from caring about specific policies that local governments do. And anytime you're interested in a policy or have an idea for a policy reform, you're eventually going to face the question, well, how do you pay for that? And when you start to ask how you pay for it, you've got to understand where the money comes from. And if you're talking about local government, you're going to be pretty immediately drawn to the topic of property taxes. Property taxes are the biggest source of tax revenue for local governments and the lion's share of all their revenue. And so if you want to understand how do you pay for whatever it is, the subject you care about, whether that's education, healthcare, public safety, if you want to know how do you pay for a policy change you might have in mind, you're going to have to grapple with the question of property taxes. And that's how I initially came to it too.
Can you tell us about your research? You started by looking at Chicago, is that right?
Yes, I would say for this research I'm doing now, which is really on the specific topic of property tax assessment, that's something that not a lot of people know about, and even a lot of scholars who deal with other aspects of property taxation don't necessarily think about the property assessment step. And I became interested in that due to some research I was doing years ago having to do with foreclosures and other issues in Chicago. And in the course of doing that research, I got some data, and I was sort of examining that data, as I said, for other reasons. And one of the patterns I noticed in that data was that low-valued properties in Chicago are systematically assessed at higher levels relative to their actual value than high-priced properties. So in other words, a low-valued home was being assessed at something like 120% of its sale price, and a high-valued home was being assessed at something like 65% of its sale price. And that's sort of how I began to be concerned about the assessment step. And as I began to do that research, I found that pattern that I had kind of observed casually in the data for another purpose was really quite widespread and long-lasting. So, and I'll talk later about my work outside of Chicago. At the time, I realized that it was a really pervasive problem in Chicago. I would later learn it's a pervasive problem, most places. But I began doing this research in Chicago just to kind of document and understand how the assessments were being done and who was being treated fairly and unfairly. And the patterns that came out of that were very clear. Low-valued homes are systematically assessed at higher rates than high-valued homes. And this is important because the tax you pay is going to be a function of what the assessor says your home is worth. So there's this view in property taxation that every property is paying the same percentage of its value in taxes, but really it's paying the same percentage of its assessed value in taxes, because for most properties, we don't know their actual value. If your home hasn't sold recently, we don't really know exactly what it's worth. That's why we have an assessor. The assessor's job is to estimate what your home is worth. And if the assessor is systematically saying that low-valued homes are worth more than they actually are, that's going to result in the people who own those homes systematically paying too much in taxes, while people at the top, if their homes are being assessed at less than what they're worth, they're going to be systematically paying too little in taxes. And this kind of tax shift, the shift of the tax burden that should be going to people who own high-priced homes onto people who are owning low-priced homes, is something we call regressivity. And my research was to show that problem is huge in Chicago. It became worse during the recession, but it's been there as long as anybody could measure it. And it results in literally billions of dollars in tax obligations being shifted from, say, the top 10% onto everybody else in the city effectively, and particularly the people on the bottom.
The Chicago research had a tangible impact on the system itself and on the local political landscape. What can you tell us about that?
This was a fortuitous series of events, because it's not always the case that research has an immediate policy impact, or that you can trace its policy impact so directly. But there was a good fortune and good luck to some extent here, because I was not the first person to discover this problem. I ultimately learned that there had been papers back to the 1970s claiming that Chicago had a regressive system of tax assessment. But it happened that at the time I was working on this, an investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune named Jason Grotto was getting interested in this topic as well and beginning to work on it, and we got connected. And he wrote a series of very high impact stories about the research and about the findings, and of course about the people who were affected by it. I think that's what really made his stories so effective. And that combination of kind of the research showing the problem and then the attention given to it in a sustained way in the media, it really brought that issue to the forefront of the public's attention at the time. It also, again, as a little bit of luck, was near to an election, and the assessor in Cook County is elected. And so this issue became huge in the assessor's election, and the assessor's election is usually a relatively obscure one. It's not the sort of office that most people on a day-to-day basis really think a lot about. But this raised, I think probably became the most high-profile race on the ballot that year. And it also kind of spilled over into other races. Even candidates for governor were taking positions on this issue. And so I think being able to put this on the spotlight in the way that those media stories did gave the chance for the research to really have an impact. And ultimately, when the election came around, the assessor was defeated just overwhelmingly, and we got a new assessor as a result. So I think the research had an impact in that respect. It'll still be some time to see exactly what the new assessor does and to what extent he will be able to fix the problem. He ran on the platform of fixing the problem and addressing these inequities, and by all accounts is endeavoring to do so, but it's too early to say probably what those results are.
How would you characterize the state of Chicago's property tax system today?
I would say influx. The new assessor had only been in office for about a year prior to, of course, the COVID pandemic, and the effect that that's going to have on the real estate market, I think, is yet to be seen. So I would say the way things work in Chicago, and this is true in a lot of places, to reassess the city, to change the system is something that takes many years for a variety of reasons. And so the assessor really has just begun that. They've done one round of assessments on one part of the county, and this will gradually extend to include the whole county. So I would say currently we're in flux. We are I think we here, I mean the people of Cook County, are expecting reforms, expecting this problem to get fixed. But like so many kinds of policy reforms, this is not one that even once you recognize the problem that you can sort of legislate out of existence immediately. It takes a lot of hard work to actually fix the problem. And so I think maybe in 2 to 3 years from now, we'll know or have a good sense of how much the new assessor is going to be able to fix this problem.
Was the Chicago experience gratifying?
Oh, it sure was. I mean, it's not that often that we get to see our research having such an obvious impact on the public debate and ultimately on election outcomes. And so it was extremely gratifying. I mean, I like to think that our research is having impacts in lots of different ways all the time. Even the research that doesn't make it onto the front page is having an impact. But those rare chances in a career when your research does make that kind of direct and measurable impact are extremely gratifying. And I think in this particular case, it was such a great characterization of the kind of policy impact that someplace like the Harris School has always been about, which is to say evidence influenced policy. And this was really a case where the data were put out there. The data spoke very clearly about the nature of the problem. We had an excellent reporter who was able to kind of convey that to ordinary people who maybe don't spend a lot of their time thinking about property assessment, and really convey to them that this is an issue fundamentally about equity in the city. And to see that result in, within a relatively short time, a turnover in leadership on that policy was extremely gratifying.
You've also delved into the issue in Detroit over a period of years. What have you found there? Is the city making progress?
Well, right around the time we were finishing up the work in Chicago, and it was making really a lot of national headlines, particularly in the assessment industry. I was contacted by folks from Detroit who were saying that they were seeing the same kind of problems there. And one of those people was Bernadette Touhane, who later became a co-author of mine on some of this work in Detroit. But she kind of reached out to me with some data and information about what was happening in Detroit. And so, when I first learned it was one of these things that I just didn't believe it. Literally, I had to go and get the data myself and check it to confirm that this was true, because it was so shocking. What was happening in Detroit, and unfortunately, what continues to happen, is that if you fail to pay your property taxes in Detroit, they foreclose on your home, and the county takes ownership of your home for failure to pay taxes. And fully 1/4 of all the homes in Detroit have been foreclosed on for this reason, for failure to pay property taxes. That's 1/4 of all the homeowners in Detroit have lost their home to their own government for failure to pay taxes. This is not about mortgage foreclosure by a bank. It's about being foreclosed on by your government. And what we've also seen is that the tax assessments in Detroit are incredibly unequitable. I thought Chicago was bad, and where we would see low-valued homes being priced at 20, 50, maybe even 100% more than what they were worth. In Detroit, it was not uncommon to see the lowest priced homes being assessed at 5 times what they were worth. And it was just such an extreme problem, even relative to Chicago, that I felt I wanted to get involved there, and so began to do some work with Bernadette to document these problems and draw the connection between tax foreclosures and overtaxation. So essentially what's happening is the city is overvaluing low-priced homes by huge proportions, then foreclosing on people for not paying those unfair taxes to begin with and taking their home. And so we wrote about that, and that also has received a lot of attention in Detroit.
Looking at property taxes on a national level, are Chicago and Detroit isolated cases?
Unfortunately not. So one of the things I've been doing since the Detroit and Chicago work, which are both ongoing, but which I would say most of the research steps of those are finished, is turn to looking at the national picture. And unfortunately, these are not isolated cases. We've just finished a study, which we'll be releasing next month, where we look at every county in the country, typically speaking, assessing as a county level function. So we look at every county in the country, and what we have found is virtually all of them have this regressivity problem to some extent. Some are worse than others. I don't think there's many that are as bad as Detroit, but it exists in most places to some extent, and it really is sort of fundamental to the property assessment process for some technical reasons that would probably, I'd be happy to, people can email me about, but maybe aren't what people want to hear about on right now. But for these reasons, it's really endemic to property assessment. And the result is that the property tax, which, as I said, is the most important source of taxation for local governments, is just fundamentally a regressive tax in its implementation. It's not regressive in its design, but it's regressive in its implementation. And this is just a pervasive problem throughout the country right now.
Should property tax reform be on the national policy agenda, or do you see it predominantly as a municipal government issue?
For the most part, the federal government does not have really much direct role in regulating property taxation. And so I don't think it should be on the federal policy agenda. I think it is a nationwide issue and should be in the national policy conversation, but one that will largely require local action. Now, there could be some policy reform at the state level. Ultimately, states are responsible for local government finance and for local tax authority, and so a lot of reforms could be conducted at the state level. But for the most part, fixing this problem is going to be the job of local governments and local assessors, not the federal government, and not fully the state governments either.
Is there anything else I should have asked or that you want to share on these topics?
Yeah, I think given the current moment, I think it's worth observing this whole property tax situation as just one kind of example of institutional racism. And we hear a lot about this in the policy debate now, whether you want to call it structural, systematic, institutional racism. And this is, to me, a textbook example. And I wrote about this and talked about it in the Chicago case, and it's generally true. The result of this system is that communities of color are paying too much in taxes. And I call it an institutional form of racism because I don't believe that there's any individual person in the assessor's office who is out of racial animus trying to raise taxes on these communities. I don't think somebody sits in the office and says, there's a Black or brown community, let's add 20% to their assessments. But I do think it's quite clear that those communities nevertheless are paying higher taxes, significantly higher on average, than, for example, white communities, because of the fact that the kind of homes that they own are systematically overtaxed.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that information with us. We really appreciate you taking the time today to talk about your research with us.
Thanks for giving me a chance to share it with you.